Welcome to Extraterrestrial Reality. Today we have a very interesting story to talk about. It was an event that occurred in 1975. It involved two young men, a 21-year-old and an 18-year-old, who were roommates. They had a trailer where they lived, and they worked late at night, and they get done early in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, something to that effect. And they had an encounter that night with a large UFO, and also one of them was abducted by aliens. This event did receive some attention by a lot of different UFO investigators. Back in the time, it was reported in newsletters like the Flying Saucer Review. In fact, all of the sources that I used for this story today, that you will find all those sources in the description below within this podcast. So it's a very interesting story, and what really one of the most fascinating aspects to it is it didn't end with the event itself. It actually morphed into something totally bizarre, where allegedly the person who hypnotized one of these young guys, he ended up getting a visit by one of the men in black, and that was one of probably the most bizarre story of all time with regards to MIB, most certainly in the top 5 for sure. So we're going to start from the top of this, and let's go. Let's begin. Basically, it starts during the early morning hours of October 27th, 1975. Two young men, one 18 and the other 21, who worked night jobs and who shared a trailer in Norway, Maine, were listening to music at home after their respective shifts ended. At around 3 a.m., they both heard an explosion outdoors, but when they investigated, they saw nothing out of the ordinary. The younger of the two men, Glen, which is a pseudonym, suggested they take a drive to a nearby lake, Lake Thompson, after his older roommate, David Stevens, said it would be nice to take a drive somewhere. As they drove along Route 26 to the lake, Glen inexplicably lost control of his 1971 Chevrolet van as it turned by itself onto a dirt road that led to nearby Oxford, Maine. Before long, the van drove to a point about a mile south of Oxford and drove past a field where a group of cows were seen sitting and shaking their heads from one side to the other. David and Glen thought the sight was strange because the cows were the only signs of life they had seen since starting their trip. Glen finally stopped the van a short distance later when they came upon two white lights shining onto the dirt road from a cornfield. At first, they thought someone was sitting in the cornfield in a truck. When the source of the lights began to rise upward, however, the young men thought it might be a helicopter. Glen turned the van off, and both young men rolled down the windows but heard absolutely no sound. They soon realized that the object, which sported white, blue, green, and yellow lights, was actually a gigantic cylinder-shaped object. They estimated it was as large as a football field. Glen restarted the van, they rolled the windows up and locked the doors and began to hightail it out of the area, but the object pursued after them. Suddenly, the van was beamed with what David would later describe as, quote, the brightest lights I've ever seen, end quote, and the next thing the two knew was that they were parked on the right side of the road and their windows were rolled down and the van doors were unlocked. The two young men noticed that their eyes had turned orange, but even more concerning, the UFO was still visible in the eastern sky. Glen turned the vehicle around and began driving back to where they came from and eventually lost sight of the UFO. Prompted by an unknown impulse, Glen turned onto another dirt road that led to Tripp Pond, which is situated at the southern point of Lake Thompson, which was where they originally were headed. They again saw the giant UFO hovering in front of them, only about 500 feet away from the van. The car radio, which was playing the entire time, faded out and the engine died. So here they are again. They saw this giant UFO. Then the next thing, some light goes flying in their eyes, it blinds them. And then the next thing you know, they're parked on the side of the road, and the windows are rolled down on the van, and doors are unlocked after they had just locked them and rolled them up. They don't know what's going on, so they decide to try to drive out of there. But then the driver, Glen, the 18-year-old, decides to turn onto some gravel road for some unknown reason, where it leads to this pond. And there at the pond, they see this giant hovering craft. But that wasn't all. Now, this is from an article from the Flying Saucer Review from back in 1976. This was written by Brent Rains. He writes, within 45 minutes to an hour of their being stuck on this road, they couldn't start the vehicle, there were two disc-shaped objects with green, red, and blue lights that appeared in the sky, spotted by P and W. Now, in this article, P is the Glen, which is also a pseudonym, but W is David Stevens. He was the 21-year-old. He's the one who went on the record with regard to this incident publicly. But anyway, they spotted what they estimated this object that they spotted was estimated that they seemed to be about a quarter of the size of the mothership, these two flying saucers, which they both agreed the mothership was the size of a football field. The discs put on a spectacular air show type of display wherein they performed aerial motions in time with one another. In falling leaf fashion, they descended to Trip Pond, skimmed across the water, and then flew upwards at right angles like ascending a pair of invisible stairs, except that these stairs would be going upward in one direction at angles and then suddenly reverse the direction. Then they noticed a strange dark gray and thick-looking fog that was rising out of the pond. Trip Pond is approximately a half mile from where they sat at the entrance of this gravel road, but during this experience it appeared to be only 20 or 50 feet from them. One section of the pond seemed to be all water as far as they could see, like an ocean, and there was an island which one of the discs seemed to fly over during its maneuvers. In reality, there are hills in the distance behind the pond and no islands are visible. At any rate, the fog soon engulfed their car, during which time a voice boomed in over the radio announcing that it was going to be a clear and bright sunny day. The mothership was the only thing visible to them above. The car started when which would have been Glen, when Glen tried again at about 6:30 a.m., and at about 7 a.m. they arrived at David's home. They had intended to keep to themselves everything that had happened, but immediately upon setting foot inside the house, they were overcome with a number of odd symptoms. They both felt lightheaded, their eyes burned, their throats became sore, they couldn't talk coherently, they suffered lack of balance and coordination, their teeth became sore and even loose. They had difficulty in breathing, and they experienced chills despite wearing heavy clothing. At one point, they were both startled at the same instance as a mental impression came to them in waves, no language as best they could describe it, wherein they were told, "We're not done with you yet, we're coming back for you." David's father, he noticed that both the young men had yellow discoloration on their skin immediately surrounding their eyes. And Glenn, he observed in the bathroom mirror that his tongue had a brownish white sort of scum on it and that it was really cracked. David recalled, when we came to, it felt like it was a desert inside my mouth. It was so dry. The experience seems to have contained a symbolic element of sorts. For example, during the initial investigation, which was that Mr. Raines had conducted on October 28th, David had remarked, what was weird was when the big one went straight up, the clouds seemed to follow it. It just took off, and all this time not a car went by. We didn't see a person or an animal or a bird, nothing. And when the cloud disappeared, 2 ducks went by, and then 2 geese went by, and then 2 ducks again went by. They were going in twos, and we noticed the cows were gutting up in twos. Now, that was the cows that they had earlier seen, that they were just laying on the ground, shaking their heads back and forth, and all of a sudden they were all rising up in twos for some reason. Neither young men recalled seeing the moon during this experience, according to some of the witnesses here, some of the people that they knew. But what was really weird about this, I want to point something out here. On October 29th, at approximately 9 o'clock in the morning, there was a knocking on the front door of the trailer where these young guys were living in Norway. And David opened the door, and he was by himself at the time, and outside stood this stockily built stranger who had a crew-cut hairstyle, wore sunglasses, and was dressed in dark blue clothing. He asked David if he was the one who had seen a flying saucer, and upon getting the affirmative, he told David, "Better keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you." With that, the stranger scurried away and around the corner of a nearby building, never to be seen again. Now, I just want to stop there for a second. Now, I don't know who this stranger was. Now, there was a short little blip in the local newspaper that appeared about this on October 28th, the following day. There was a little blurb that appeared in the newspaper, in the local newspaper. So I'm assuming I don't know if the names were given at the time. I don't think that they were. The names of these 2 witnesses were not apparently in this article, which, by the way, I have trouble. I was unable to find that article. But there was... So this was mentioned in the article. Then the next day, on the 29th, somebody shows up at their house saying, "You better keep your mouth shut about this." Now, to me, right, this one here sounds like it could have been government, right? That's what this one sounds like. This man in black, or it wasn't even a man in black. He was wearing a blue suit, right? But he basically threatened David Stevens and then just disappeared. But anyway, these people, David and his friend Glen, they both decided to talk to UFO researchers about this incident because they thought it was something that was important, obviously. Now, David continued to work with the investigators, but Glenn, who we don't know what his real name is, he never was hypnotized, and he decided to stop working with them because his parents thought he was lying or crazy, apparently. But now David's parents, they didn't think he was making this up. They thought he was telling the truth. They didn't think he was the type of person that would do something like this or make something up like this. But anyway, I want to get into what happened now with when David went under hypnosis. Now, there's another article from the same newsletter that was written by a UFO investigator named Shirley Fickett, and she talks about the sessions. There was multiple sessions that they started in December and they lasted all the way into March, and they were conducted with this person, this Dr. Herbert Hopkins. And the first session really didn't get much information out about it. Now, actually, during the first session, Glenn, the 18-year-old, he was there for that, but that was the last time he showed up for this. There's a lot a lot of information with regard to this. So if you're really interested in this story, most certainly check out the sources that I leave in the description. You will most certainly find a lot of stuff there. There's a lot to this case. But anyway, I thought this was interesting. Session 2, which occurred on December 10th, 1975, this is where they finally started getting somewhere here. It says, at this session, a complete description was given by David of the earthly appearing man who approached him on October 29th and threatened him not to divulge any further information about the UFO encounter. Again, there was further review of what happened on the conscious level in order to bring David to the point where the light hit the car. And the session ended with David's statement that he was outside of the car at the point when it was in the process of skidding sideways after being hit by the light from the UFO. He was reluctant to give any more information, and he was then counted out from the trance. And they says here that the first 2 sessions lasted approximately 15 minutes, but then the third session lasted a little bit longer. And this happened on December 17th, 1975. This time, David was in a more emotional state than at any time other than the final session. Dr. Hopkins guided his subject back through time, bringing him to the area where he concluded session 2 when the car was hit by the light. After much probing, David stated that he was standing on a floor suspended above, looking through a window and observing the car sliding sideways with his friend still within. Further questioning revealed he was standing in a room approximately 15 feet high and 35 feet in diameter. There was one door in the room and the walls caved inwards as they rose. There was no furniture, and at this point David was alone. It was soon established that a non-human being came in to join David. Although it was not human, we learned from David that it was a living being, but not of this world. At this point, as Dr. Hopkins instructed David to observe the creature and relate what he saw, it was obvious that he was under great stress and his breathing became labored. But he continued. His voice trembled slightly as he described the being as about 4.5 feet tall, wearing a garment that looked like a sheet and having a face that was not at all human. And David was having much difficulty finding words to describe the face of the visitor, and an emotion rose once more, making it impossible for him to forge ahead. So that session was brought to a close. And then on the 4th session on December 23rd, 1975, David seemed to be much calmer as Dr. Hopkins slipped into the area where he had left off in the previous session. It was stated that the creature walked on feet, had hands and arms. It had 3 fingers that were webbed. In a later session, David stated there were 4 fingers, but the doctor established that one appendage was a thumb, not a finger. This was the only time David would discuss the shoes worn by the creature in spite of repeated questioning about it later. He stated the shoes looked as if they were made of paper. And then Hopkins went to explore the face of the creature. We learned that the skin was white and that the head was shaped like a mushroom and that it had 2 eyes. Later, David stated that they were slanted eyes, large and white in color, and they were unblinking. The nose was small and rounded. No mouth could be observed, not at first anyway. The creature, and not during this session, I don't think. I believe it does. He does talk about a mouth later on. The creature began relating to David by what he referred to as brainwaves. David, speaking of telepathically, basically. By this manner, he was told not to be afraid, that he would not be harmed. And when it was asked by the doctor if the creature told David who he was, he said no. When asked if the creature inquired who David was, the answer was he already knew my name. Next, David said he was escorted to another room where he met 4 more similar beings. This room was described as being like a hospital room with what appeared to be an operating table. It had equipment and machinery. 2 needles full of blood were extracted from David's arm at the elbow of his right arm. After this, they tried to make him lie down on the table for an examination. He rebelled, hitting one of the creatures in the face. In response, it just looked at him and showed no signs of retaliation. That's interesting. That's similar to what happened with Travis Walton. He said that he hit back at one of these creatures, and they just looked at him and walked out of the room. When he first woke up, after getting blasted by the flying saucer, the next thing you know, he was waking up in some room, and there was these weird aliens standing around him with big heads, and he threatened one of them, and we grabbed some sort of an object that he didn't know what it was, but he threatened them with it, and they just walked out of the room. This guy here hit them. I guess to these alien creatures, that's expected. I I would expect an animal to try to bite me if you taking it to a vet or something that doesn't want to get a shot. That could happen. And I think this is the same way we human beings act when we're taken and forcibly examined by beings that are more that are smarter than us, that are more advanced than us, for sure. Anyway, continuing here, it says he rebelled, hitting one of the creatures in the face. In response, it just looked at him and showed no signs of retaliation. At this point, David was beginning to breathe deeply and show signs of uneasiness. So once more, he was brought back to consciousness. And then the next session was the 5th one on January 14th, 1976. Hopkins took David back once more to the subject of the appearance of the creatures. Their garments were black in color. Because David had stated they looked like sheets, we had assumed they were white. This was a surprise. So when he initially said they looked like sheets, but they were black, not white. The sleeves of the garments were flowing and extended to the hands. The gowns were long. Their arms appeared short compared to the body structure, and David did not notice whether they had fingernails or not, although he observed their fingers were of different lengths and that they had joints like ours, but were thinner than the human finger. Their garments seemed to be made of paper. Here, Dr. Hopkins named all manners of materials, but nothing seemed to fit but paper. There was no hair on their heads. Attention was next focused upon the room and the table within. After hitting the creature, David had finally relented and laid down to be examined. The table was white and soft. There were bright lights overhead, and David stated that an instrument was used for the examination. When asked if it hurt, the reply was negative. The subject had once more been under hypnosis for the allotted time and was thereupon counted back to subconsciousness, counted back to consciousness. And then the 6th session on January 21st, 1976, this is when they started the interrogation about the examination. And here's some drawings. Now the drawing on the left here is one that was drawn by Shirley Fickett, based on what David was stating, and this other one here beside it is one that was drawn by David himself after the hypnotic session on February 21st, 1976. This is what they look like. Anyway, it says the machine used was square with gauges on the sides. The machine used was square with gauges on the side, knobs in the middle. They had an extension on it about 4 feet long, and at the end of this was a smaller machine which slid over David's body as it was maneuvered, but did not come in contact with the body. His clothes were removed, all of them. This bothered David, but although the room felt cool, he was not cold. Hopkins named all the parts of the body when asking if they were examined: eyes, nose, mouth, ears, chest, etc. Each time the answer was yes. Traveling further down the body, the question was asked, did they examine your genitals? When this was confirmed, the next question was, did they do anything to them? The answer to this was in the negative. So the questions went on to all the other parts of the body. It appeared there was a thorough going over on the part of the intruders from head to feet. A small sample of hair was taken and put into an empty container. There were no other machines used and no wires were attached. It was estimated that the examination took about 40 to 45 minutes in all. And he ended up putting his clothes back on by himself. And the beings began to communicate with him telepathically, saying they had been watching him for some time and wanted to study him. They stated they would be seeing him again, and he was given a shot of something. This was administered in the right arm near the shoulder. He was told that it might make him a little tired. When asked if it did, he stated yes, about a week later. After this, David was escorted back to the room where it all began and related that next he was back in the car with his friend Glen. And before awakening, Hopkins went on to a few more questions, asking if there were a lot of test tubes in the hospital room. The answer was yes. We learned that a fingernail sample was taken and bottled. There was more questioning as to what was done with the blood samples. And David stated that after the samples were placed on a table, they were taken from the room by one of the creatures. Upon being asked how he felt about returning to the car, David related that it felt like there was glass in his eyes. The doctor asked if this told pretty much the story of what happened while David was unconscious, and the answer was affirmative. So basically, this guy was abducted, and this doctor tried to help him. And there's a lot more. You could read this article. There's a lot more to talk about with this. It's very, very fascinating. But what came next is also fascinating. We'll get into that in a minute. But to me, this looks like this kid, 21 years old, David, was taken. They were going to use him for their alien abduction program. They're going to. I think this was probably. It sounds to me like this might have been the beginning of it for this poor guy. They take him that first time. They did these tests on him. They told him they're going to be seeing him again. For all we know, he probably was getting visited for the rest of his life. Maybe he doesn't even realize it, right? But I'm assuming that what's happened here, in service to their alien abduction hybridization program, they probably were okay. This is one of the subjects. We're going to use this guy. We're going to test him out, and we'll continue to use him as time goes on. That's what I think. That's what it sounds like to me. It sounds like your classic kind of situation. There, time and time again, there have been stories like this we've heard throughout the years. You don't hear a lot of these stories happening recently. I don't hear a lot of people stepping up. There are some, right, but not as many as there used to be back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, right? It seemed like there was a lot more of this activity going on. And it makes me wonder that right now if that part of the program is pretty much wrapped up for the most part. You have to wonder. I would imagine that I could assume for sure that a lot of abductees are still being used for other purposes, but not for this one in particular. They might have a lot of the hybrids. Maybe they're at that point now where they don't really need humans. I don't know as much. Or another explanation to this could be that over time their technology has improved and they have better ways of making people forget about their experiences when they do get abducted. Maybe that's the explanation for it. I don't know, but I do know that there a lot of these cases, especially during this time, this is a scenario. This is what would happen, and so a lot of them were sexual in nature. They did examine his genitals, although under hypnosis, that's about the extent of it. They didn't go any further. They didn't seem to take anything from him, like they didn't extract semen or anything like that. It doesn't seem, according to this article. But that doesn't mean it did something like that. That could have happened later on. This could have been the beginning of it for this guy. Then again, all of this that I'm talking about is speculation, right? But the bottom line is that these things do happen. These things do come after people. I know for a fact. I encountered one of these creatures. It was in my room when I was a kid, so I know, right? And as do a lot of other people. And we have the evidence now that shows that these things are real. That creatures are here on this planet that are not human and most certainly are more advanced than we are technologically. There's just no question about it. But the next thing that happened that I thought was really interesting with this case is that Dr. Hopkins was approached by somebody, and this happened later on in September of 1976. Somebody showed up at his house when nobody else was home. His family had gone out to a drive-in movie, and then he was contacted by he gets a phone call from someone saying he's from some New Jersey UFO organization. And he would like to talk to him about this case. So Hopkins is like, okay, yeah, you could stop by. And no sooner did he hang the phone up, the guy was knocking on the door. And the problem with this, according to Hopkins, was that the nearest phone booth was blocks away. There would have been no way, because back then there were no cell phones, so there would have been no way for this person to just hang up the phone and then suddenly start knocking on the door. So he doesn't know how that happened. Unless he had a phone in his car, one of those, there were some government agencies that did have something like that. But again, things back then worked a lot differently than they do now. It just seems like it was almost an impossibility for this person to show up as like he did. However, we're going to use some of, this is a book that from Jenny Randall's, she's a researcher from the United Kingdom, The Truth Behind Men in Black, and she talks about this incident with Hopkins. And she writes here on page 171, No sooner had Hopkins agreed to this and switched on the living room light to set things up that the ufologist was seen to be approaching the front door. In retrospect, Hopkins realized this was amazingly fast. He could not even have got there from the main road, let alone the nearest phone booth, in the few seconds involved. However, this minor puzzle was put aside, and the doctor let the stranger in despite his odd appearance. It was only later, as so many MIB witnesses have reported, that Hopkins realized just how out of character was his own behavior on that evening. To say the visiting UFO enthusiast was odd is perhaps an understatement. He was dressed entirely in black and looked like an undertaker. When he took off his hat, he revealed a bald head, but he also had no eyebrows or lashes. He also wore lipstick on a very pale face, as proven later when it smeared on the back of his glove as he wiped his mouth. In fact, as Dr. Hopkins noted with astonishment, the lipstick was drawn on to the man's chalk white face as if to imitate lips. There were no real lips at all. He looked just like a china doll wearing clothes so clean and fresh that they might have come from a store window dummy. And then the stranger also spoke with a flat monotone in perfect English, allowing the doctor to relate the sighting back to him and detail his investigation of it. Once the story was told, this encounter quickly went into real X-File territory. The MIB now announced that the doctor had only 2 coins in his left pocket. Indeed, he had. He was asked to take one out and brought out a 1-cent piece. Holding this between his fingers, the stranger asked Hopkins to watch the coin as if he were about to perform a magic trick. Then, as Hopkins reports, it suddenly began to develop a silvery color, and the silver became blue, and then I had trouble focusing. I could focus on my hand perfectly well. That was my reference point, but the coin was simply gone. Not abruptly, it simply slowly dematerialized. It just wasn't there anymore. I didn't smell anything, I didn't feel anything, I didn't hear anything. Hopkins reports that he noticed the weight of the coin gradually vanishing. He is sure it was not sleight of hand. He saw it literally vanish on the spot. The MIB made some curious remark that nobody in this plane would ever see the coin again. Then he asked the doctor if he heard of a famous UFO witness who had recently died but had lived nearby. Dr. Hopkins agreed he had heard the name, but he had never met the man and knew nothing of his death. The man in black said, "Just as you do not have a coin, so he no longer has a heart." Now, the person he's talking about that Jenny Randall's estate here was actually Barney Hill, who had passed away in 1969 from heart issues. So this guy in black was telling Hopkins that, this is what's going to happen to you too. Just like that coin disappeared in your hand, that guy's heart disappeared in his chest. Now this wasn't true, but this is what the guy was doing. He was threatening him. And according to Randall's here, the threat was implicit but obvious. Whilst the facts of the death of this witness do not support this frightening allegation, Herbert Hopkins did not know the details at the time and was understandably spooked. Immediately he agreed to the request politely made of him by the man who now was very obviously not a ufologist. This was that he should destroy all of the tapes made during the interviews with David Stevens. And so that's what he did. He actually went after this encounter with this man in black. This doctor went and destroyed all the tapes. He was so scared he destroyed all the tapes of all the sessions that he had with David Stevens. That's what happened, because this guy scared him so bad. And he didn't realize it till later. He says days later, when rationality returned, the doctor began to see the folly of what he had done. The Stevens case was already public knowledge. No purpose was served by his act. At the conclusion of the session, the man began to talk in a curious way. His voice slowed down like a battery tape recorder needing a recharge. "My energy is running low, must go now, goodbye," he said, and left. Hopkins watched him walk out, negotiating the steps as if they were the slopes of Everest, and clinging to the wall at the side of the house for a long time before turning the corner. Moments later, a very brilliant bluish-white light, too bright to be a car headlight, sped laterally across the front of the house. And needless to say, later on he also found out that there was no such thing as the New Jersey UFO Research Organization, and nobody knows who the guy was that showed up at his house. But it doesn't sound like it was a human being. It sounds more like a robot. Now here's the question, though. Was Herbert Hopkins making that part of the story up? That's what somebody believes is exactly what happened. And we're going to get into that right now, because I believe it's necessary to cover every angle of a story like this, because he might have been making it up. In fact, he had a nephew named Howard Hopkins, who back in January of 2008 wrote this little piece on a blog that he had, and it's now no longer exists, but thanks to the Wayback Machine, we could still read it. And here's what it says. This is what the doctor's nephew wrote years later, after his uncle had died. It says, I got a phone call the other day from an interviewer for an internet show dealing with unusual occurrences and the supernatural. The person I spoke with was interested in a member of my family who'd passed away a couple years back, and a certain experience that relative had reported. I hadn't thought about the story in ages, but it was an interesting conversation and dispelled something that probably had gone on for too long. My uncle's name was Dr. Herbert Hopkins. Most of you will say, huh? And rightly so. A few of you who are, like me, interested in studying legitimate, unusual phenomena may recognize the name, and a handful really into investigating strange occurrences may know exactly who I am talking about. Those who don't, stay tuned and I'll fill you in. And then he talks about this, what his uncle did and everything. But then he talks about what he believes really is the story here. He goes on to write, he goes, the story originally appeared in the tabloid rag The Star, though I clearly recall the night he first told it. I had just entered high school and my grandparents were up from Florida. They were the ones who my aunt was out with that fateful night and who brought the story back to me. It was later picked up with minor variations or embellishment in Time Life's Mysteries of the Unknown, the excellent encyclopedia set Mysteries of Mind, Space, and Time, and Jenny Randall's book, The Truth Behind the Men in Black, among others. The story goes like this, and he relates the story of what happened. But then he writes, my uncle was, unfortunately, a fantasy-prone individual, craved the center of attention and limelight, and on a base level, he sometimes just made things up, no matter how hyperbolic, to top everybody else. As brilliant as he was in many areas, however, he was unskilled at fiction. And for much of the 70s and 80s, he was an alcoholic. Every night was spent alone with a magnum of wine. He made his own wine, too, in a still in the basement. He would stumble up the stairs at about 5 a.m., tripping over the invisible dog. How did I know about the invisible dog? Well, a handful of times when I was sleeping over, I would be awake and hear the tripping and the inevitable curse, "Goddamn dog!" The real dog, incidentally, was next to me on the bed, staring out at the hall, wondering what the hell the thud had been. The bottom line for this particular man in black tale is unfortunately pretty mundane. This mysterious being in black, inspired by cheap fiction and alcohol, probably less of a malicious intent and more from some sad need for attention, was, alas, a simple lie, one that needs to be corrected for those into serious research into this area. So this guy's nephew believed his uncle was a liar and he was just a drunk and just made this story up. He didn't offer any evidence other than to say that, yeah, he was just an alcoholic in life and sometimes made stories up. I don't know. I think it comes down to who do you believe here? Who do you believe here? I don't know. It's really hard to say, right? The story, I can tell you this. The first time I learned of this incident, the man in black aspect of this case, right, I thought to myself, this can't be real. This is too fantastic. I mean, it sounds something like out of a movie. It really did. But then again, I don't know. There are a lot of people have weird encounters with men in black, and they are very strange. They're very strange encounters. I mean, there's many of them I've went over on this show. And the things they do, the things they say, the way they disappear, how they act, it's just very strange. And this falls into that, to me, right? It's a pretty good story, pretty interesting. It was detailed. The disappearing coin, the discussion about your heart's going to disappear, just like Barney Hill's. I mean, I don't know. I don't think this was. I don't know. I guess that's the bottom line. I don't know. You have a relative telling you he was a drunk and he made stuff up sometimes. At the same time, he did investigate this story and he did have a bunch of different tape sessions of this, and he also talked about this. I'm going to leave a link where you could actually hear this guy, Dr. Herbert Hopkins, talking about this after it happened. That was recorded as well. I'm not going to play that because of copyright concerns and all of that kind of stuff, but I will leave a link to that as well. I just think this is a fascinating story all around. Whether or not the Men in Black aspect to it is true or false, I don't think it matters. I believe that the first part of the story most certainly was true, and I wouldn't put it. I don't think that I'm not going to say the Men in Black incident didn't happen. I'm just saying I don't know based on what the family member here said. But I think that this is a fascinating story. That's one that needs to be talked about more. I just think more people need to be aware of this. And I do know a lot of people out there over the years have written about this, and there are some other podcasts that bring it up every now and then. And I think it's something that people who are interested in this subject, they should be aware of this case because it's a really good one, I think. Anyway, I want to say this. I want to say thank you all for joining me today. Until next time.